It began in a year that felt heavy from the very first days, a year where mornings came too fast and nights refused to bring rest, a year in which everything familiar seemed slightly out of place, as if life had shifted a few centimeters to the left and no one had bothered to explain why. He woke up every day with the same routine, the same streets, the same faces, yet inside him grew a quiet tension he could not name. It was not sadness in its pure form, nor anger, nor fear, but a slow accumulation of unspoken thoughts, of decisions postponed, of words swallowed because they felt inconvenient or too risky. He had once believed that time alone would solve most things, that patience was a kind of wisdom, but time had proven to be indifferent, passing by without fixing anything unless he moved with it. The city around him continued to function perfectly well without his clarity. People laughed in cafes, argued on public transport, fell in love, broke up, started again, while he stood still, convincing himself that standing still was a choice rather than a habit. As weeks turned into months, small moments began to take on an unexpected weight. A random conversation with a stranger on a train, a sentence overheard in a bookstore, the way an elderly man carefully tied his shoes on a park bench, these fragments started to feel like quiet signals, reminders that everyone carried invisible battles, that stagnation was not unique, but neither was it inevitable. He began to notice how often he avoided discomfort, how easily he chose the familiar disappointment over the unknown possibility, and this realization unsettled him more than any external failure ever had. At night, lying awake, he replayed old choices not with regret, but with curiosity, asking himself what would have happened if he had said yes more often, if he had trusted his instincts before they learned to doubt themselves. It became clear that the greatest distance he had ever traveled was not measured in kilometers, but in the gap between who he was and who he kept postponing becoming. The turning point did not arrive as a dramatic event, there was no sudden loss, no shocking news, no cinematic revelation. It arrived quietly, disguised as exhaustion. One evening, after another day that felt identical to the last, he realized he could no longer pretend that comfort was enough. Comfort had kept him safe, but it had also kept him small. That night, he made a decision so modest it almost felt insignificant. He would change one thing, just one, and see what happened. No grand promises, no detailed plan, just movement. He started waking up earlier, not to be productive, but to reclaim a piece of the day before it was consumed by obligations. He walked longer routes home, listened more than he spoke, wrote thoughts down instead of letting them dissolve into the background noise of his mind. These small shifts did not fix his life, but they cracked something open, and through that crack came air. With time, resistance appeared, as it always does when change threatens old structures. Doubt whispered that it was too late, that this effort was temporary, that people did not truly transform, they only distracted themselves. But alongside doubt grew something sturdier: awareness. He began to see patterns in his behavior, the way he sabotaged progress the moment it required vulnerability, the way he confused independence with isolation, strength with silence. Facing these truths was uncomfortable, sometimes painful, yet strangely grounding. For the first time in years, his struggles felt honest. He allowed himself to fail in visible ways, to admit confusion without immediately trying to resolve it, to sit with uncertainty instead of running from it. In doing so, he discovered that clarity often arrives not when answers are found, but when the right questions are finally asked. Gradually, relationships shifted. Some people drifted away, unsettled by his new boundaries or his refusal to play familiar roles, while others drew closer, responding to a version of him that felt more present, more real. He learned that not all losses were tragedies, some were corrections. He stopped measuring his worth by speed or comparison, understanding that growth does not follow a straight line and cannot be rushed without breaking something essential. There were days he slipped back into old habits, days when the weight returned, but now he recognized them as moments, not destinations. Progress became less about constant improvement and more about returning to himself again and again, even after detours. In the end, the road back to oneself was not a single journey with a clear finish, but a continuous practice, a choice renewed daily. He understood that life would never become permanently easy or perfectly aligned, and that was no longer a problem to solve. What mattered was the ability to stay awake within it, to respond rather than react, to move even when movement felt slow. The quiet tension that once filled his days did not disappear entirely, but it transformed into something else: a signal, a reminder to listen, to adjust, to keep going. And in that ongoing motion, in that imperfect persistence, he found not a final answer, but something far more sustainable, a sense of direction rooted not in fear of staying the same, but in trust that change, however gradual, was possible. What he did not expect was how the road, once chosen, would begin to reshape his understanding of time itself. Days no longer felt like empty containers to be filled with obligations, but like living material, flexible and responsive to intention. He started to sense the difference between being busy and being engaged, between motion that exhausted and motion that nourished. There were mornings when nothing extraordinary happened, yet he felt a quiet satisfaction simply because he had stayed honest with himself, because he had not betrayed his own attention by rushing through experiences that deserved presence. This shift did not make life softer; if anything, it sharpened it. Joy became more precise, pain more instructive, and boredom transformed into a signal rather than a sentence. He realized that awareness, once awakened, could not be fully put back to sleep, and that realization came with responsibility. With that responsibility came a deeper confrontation with fear. Not the obvious fears he had named before: failure, rejection, instability, but the subtler ones that hid behind good intentions. The fear of outgrowing people he loved, the fear of choosing a path that could not be easily explained, the fear of discovering that his limits were not imposed by circumstances but by belief. These fears surfaced unexpectedly, in moments of success as much as in moments of doubt, and each time they did, he practiced something unfamiliar: he did not immediately try to overcome them. Instead, he observed them, traced their origins, noticed how they spoke in borrowed voices from the past. This practice did not weaken fear instantly, but it stripped it of authority. Fear became information, not command, and in that distinction lay freedom. As seasons changed, he found himself drawn toward experiences he had once dismissed as impractical or unnecessary. Long conversations without a clear purpose, creative efforts with no promise of recognition, silence that did not need to be filled, all of these became essential. He discovered that meaning often emerged not from achievement, but from coherence, from living in a way that did not require constant self-justification. There were setbacks, of course, moments when old patterns returned with convincing arguments, when exhaustion tempted him to abandon awareness for numbness. But even then, something fundamental had shifted. He no longer mistook retreat for rest, nor distraction for relief. He learned to pause without quitting, to recover without erasing progress. The world around him did not transform to match his inner changes, and that, too, became a lesson. People still disappointed, systems still failed, uncertainty remained a constant companion. Yet his relationship with these realities evolved. He stopped waiting for permission to live fully, stopped postponing meaning until conditions improved. He understood that life was not something that began after problems were solved, it was something that unfolded through them. This understanding did not make him immune to frustration or grief, but it anchored him during both. He could grieve without losing direction, celebrate without clinging, and plan without assuming control. Over time, the question that once haunted him, who he was becoming, softened into a quieter, more generous inquiry: how he wished to meet each moment. The answer changed from day to day, but the intention remained steady. To be present without rigidity, open without losing discernment, committed without becoming trapped. He accepted that becoming oneself was not about uncovering a fixed identity, but about maintaining an honest relationship with change. And so the road continued, not as a burden to endure, but as a living process, shaped by attention, courage, and the willingness to keep walking even when certainty lagged behind.